They trade in weapons, human trafficking, drugs, entire private armies waging war for territorial control, intimidation of the local population, and even police forces. How and why did Mexican cartels become the most terrifying threat to the country? What funds their private armies? How do they conduct business? And why do Mexican cartels wield such enormous influence? The Sinaloa cartel is the most famous and influential cartel in the world. Its founder, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, became a legend not only for his brutality, but also for his numerous prison escapes. Sinaloa controls key drug trafficking routes to the US and Europe. After El Chapo's arrest, the cartel did not weaken. Instead, thanks to its complex power structure, it continues to thrive, led by other leaders. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel is a young but rapidly growing force on the criminal scene. Madness and pure ultra-violence characterize them. They are known for their extreme brutality. Jalisco is taking control of more territories and is rapidly expanding its borders, including transatlantic operations. Their leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, is one of the most wanted criminals in the world. Los Zetas, a former elite force and special unit that realized at some point that they could gain much more by protecting and guarding cargo instead of citizens. The dark side pays more. Los Zetas are distinguished by military discipline, harsh tactics, and a lack of moral boundaries. They are involved not only in drugs, but also actively in kidnappings, extortion, and human trafficking. These three organizations are just the tip of the iceberg. Besides them, there are many smaller cartels that sometimes unite or fight each other for control of streets, cities, and even entire states. It's like a constant game of chess where any piece can be taken out at any moment, but the game never ends. Cartels are no longer just drug runners. They control their territories at all levels, from drug trade to illegal businesses in arms trafficking, human trafficking, and extortion. In some regions, they have become the de facto rulers, replacing state authority and offering protection to local residents. Although this protection more closely resembles a brutal feudal system. But how have these and numerous other drug cartels become so powerful? And just how powerful are they? What role do they play in the economy? And what influence do they exert over various sectors? Large-scale drug trafficking in Mexico began in the 1940s. At that time, impoverished farmers from the state of Sinaloa started growing marijuana to avoid starvation. In the 1960s, cocaine was added to their operations. But until the mid-1990s, Mexico was merely a transit point in the larger game dominated by Colombian drug cartels. With their decline and the closure of the main drug route from Colombia to Florida, Mexico became the sole pathway for delivering cocaine to the United States. From that point on, local gangs transformed into influential and virtually the only suppliers of all South American cocaine. Today, due to Mexican drug cartels, the United States is ranked first in the world for cocaine and marijuana consumption. Local drug gangs earn between $25 and $40 billion annually, and aside from transporting and exporting 90% of all cocaine through Mexico, 30% of agricultural enterprises in Mexico cultivate marijuana. No drug war compares to the drug wars in Mexico. Due to the swift takeover of the cocaine market in the 1990s, former members from the state of Sinaloa began forming groups, expanding with private armies, and fiercely competing with each other. Major Mexican gangs split into two rival factions. The first included the Juarez Cartel, Los Zetas, formed from a former branch of the Mexican Special Forces GAFE, the Tijuana Cartel, and the Beltran-Leyva Cartel. The second group consisted of the Gulf Cartel, where Los Zetas once served as a strike force, the Sinaloa Cartel, La Familia Michoacana, the Oaxaca Cartel, and Los Negros. Each cartel established its own army. drug gangs drew in both ordinary Mexicans with nowhere else to turn and former police officers. They were paid significantly more than their official salaries and supplied with the most modern weapons. Recruitment centers for the gangs were often located near or even across from police stations. Even if a police officer was somehow dismissed for bribery or abetting drug trafficking, they could simply cross the street and join a cartel. It is known that from 2000 to 2006, around 100,000 employees left the Mexican police and army. All of them joined the ranks of the drug mafia, were familiar with governmental operations, and shared valuable information with the gangs. It is fitting to recall the words of a representative from Los Zetas, one of the most powerful cartels today.
"We are unbeatable because we know how the authorities work, and they know nothing about our operations."
Where do cartels get their funding today? When you think of the word cartel, drugs are probably the first thing that comes to mind as their main source of income. But is it true that the majority of their money comes from drugs? Today, that's not entirely the case. Cartels seize lands and clear forests, then prepare the soil for growing. No, not marijuana, not even cocaine, and nothing typically associated with drug cartels. Instead, they start cultivating something more profitable: avocados. Mexico's multi-billion-dollar avocado industry, headquartered in the state of Michoacán, has become a prime target for cartels. They take over farms and protected forests to cultivate green gold themselves. Over a dozen criminal groups are vying for control of the avocado trade in Uruapan and its surroundings. They target wealthy orchard owners, harvesters, and drivers transporting avocados north to the United States. "The threat is constant and widespread," says Jose Maria Ayala Montero, an official from a trade association that has formed its own volunteer army to protect farmers. After the cartel Viagra took control of the forest, they announced a tax for tree owners. They charged them $250 per hectare as a protection fee. However, they faced competitors from the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who also wanted control over the same land. As a result, the local residents were nearly caught in the midst of a violent struggle when a convoy of pickup trucks with Jalisco gunmen stormed into the forest, leading to an hour-long shootout. Juan Madrigal Miranda, a 72-year-old professor managing a small nature center in the area, would drop to the floor of his small cabin every time he heard the whistling of bullets. Eventually, fear gave way to anger. He was infuriated by the growing power of the criminals, 10 of whom died in the forest on that same day.
"Across the country, cartels are claiming land, forests, and water," Madrigal said indignantly. "They are fighting over the basic means of subsistence."
Mexico is experiencing a record-high number of homicides. The country is globally recognized as the birthplace of some of the most powerful and ruthless drug traffickers. However, nowadays, fewer and fewer murders are related to this cause. The criminal world has diversified. In the state of Guanajuato, the number of homicides has nearly tripled over the past 3 years. Criminals are fighting for access to oil pipelines to steal and resell fuel. In parts of the state of Guerrero, cartels control gold mining and even set prices in supermarkets. In the city of Altamirano, a local Coca-Cola plant closed its distribution center in 2018 after more than a dozen groups extorted money from it. The Pepsi plant followed suit several months later. In Mexico City, bar owners in upscale neighborhoods pay protection money to a local gang. The instances of cargo robbery on highways across the country have increased by more than 75% since 2016. Drug trafficking is a complex and risky business that requires managing people across the Western Hemisphere. In comparison, the new criminal enterprises resemble local businesses much more closely, with a significantly lower barrier to entry. The notorious Los Zetas cartel was the first to adopt this approach to organized crime. They adapted in response to the government's war on drug traffickers, declared in 2006. Mexican authorities, with US support, focused on capturing and eliminating cartel leaders. Unfortunately, this only worsened the situation, as large cartels fragmented into smaller gangs that sought profit wherever they could. Smaller groups find it much easier to prey on the local population, says Falco Ernst, an analyst with the International Crisis Group in Mexico, which advocates for nonviolent conflict resolution. It's a myth that crime is only related to drugs. In Michoacán, where dozens of cartel splits have occurred over the past 12 years, the incursion into the avocado industry is just a drop in the ocean compared to what is happening in other parts of the country. It's a clear example of how government actions can unintentionally trigger even more violence. People wistfully remember the early 1990s, when only one cartel in the region was involved in drug trafficking, and peace largely prevailed. At that time, the Valencia family was seen as local Robin Hoods. They built churches, gave money to the sick, and prevented violence, thus paying off local authorities to facilitate the smooth transportation of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine to the United States. By 2000, however, traffickers from other parts of the country began to envy the Valencias, particularly for their control over the port of Lázaro Cárdenas on Michoacán's Pacific coast. The Gulf Cartel, based in the eastern state of Tamaulipas, engaged them in battle by sending the paramilitary group Los Zetas. Created in the late 1990s by deserters from an elite Mexican military unit, Los Zetas adopted a new philosophy regarding drug trafficking. Instead of merely controlling strategic points along the routes, they decided to get a piece of the business and thereby minimize risk. In Tamaulipas, they defaulted to taking a share from the sale of stolen gasoline and illegally smuggling migrants across the border. In Michoacán, Los Zetas formed partnerships with locals to drive Valencia out of business and then began extorting money from cattle ranchers and lime producers. Over time, local partners rebelled, branding Los Zetas as outsider thieves. Nevertheless, they did not hesitate to adopt their predatory tactics. One reason for the global power of the cartels is their involvement in the international logistics of drug trafficking. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel have established drug supplies to the US, which remains the largest market. According to the Drug Enforcement Administration, more than 90% of cocaine entering the US comes through Mexican channels. In recent years, the cartels have also become major suppliers of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid causing thousands of overdose deaths. Europe is another promising market. The cartels collaborate with the Italian mafia, Albanian criminal groups, and British drug networks, utilizing ports in Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. In 2022, Belgian authorities intercepted a record 110 tons of cocaine, a significant portion of which was linked to Mexican cartels. Beyond drug trafficking, cartels profit from illegal migration. They control the flow of refugees from Central America to the United States, charging fees for crossing the border. In recent years, their revenues from human smuggling have increased dramatically, and violence at the border has intensified. Cartels are actively involved in the shadow economy, using cryptocurrency and offshore accounts for money laundering. Analysts estimate that they earn between $20 to $50 billion a year, competing with the largest corporations in the world. The networks of cartels permeate any sphere where the word money is involved. Corruption is one of the main factors ensuring the power of Mexican drug cartels. For decades, they have infiltrated political structures, bribing officials, law enforcement officers, and even judges. The cartel's ties to power date back to the 20th century, when drug smuggling was considered a lucrative business rather than a national security threat. In 2006, President Felipe Calderón declared war on the cartels, deploying the army to eliminate them. However, this only led to chaos. large cartels split into numerous smaller groups, and a wave of violence began. Meanwhile, the cartels continued to corrupt the system. Many city mayors, governors, and even representatives of the federal government were found to be linked to crime. An example is the mayor of the Mexican city of Iguala, who was involved in the disappearance of 43 students in 2014. He collaborated with the Guerreros Unidos cartel, and his administration covered up for the criminals. This case sparked international outcry and became a symbol of the intertwining of power and organized crime in Mexico. Cartels also infiltrate electoral processes, financing candidates who subsequently work in their interests. In 2021, before regional elections in Mexico, more than 80 politicians were killed, including candidates for mayoral and gubernatorial positions. This underscores the influence of criminal groups on state institutions. For a long time, cartels were able to operate freely because their leaders found common ground with high-ranking officials. Historically, Mexican presidents either did not interfere with the cartel's affairs or collaborated with them. For example, according to investigations, during the presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, cartel representatives actively engaged with the ruling party, providing funding in exchange for government non-interference. Despite anti-corruption campaigns, cartels remain deeply embedded in the political system. Today, they can be described as entire corporations, even if their members do not wear business suits to discuss deals in conference rooms atop skyscrapers, nor do they sip banana milk lattes in the process. Even some law enforcement agencies work for the criminals. For instance, in 2019, former Security Minister Genaro Garcia Luna was arrested for assisting the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for bribes. Thus, drug cartels in Mexico are not just criminal organizations, but structures closely linked to politics. Corruption makes them practically invulnerable, allowing them to maintain influence even amid armed efforts against them. What methods do cartels use for intimidation, control, and dealing with adversaries? 4 years ago, news emerged online that Mexican cartels had started producing combat drones with explosives. Initially, this seemed like something out of science fiction, but it turned out to be quite true. Mexican drug cartels began using drones to wage war against the police. On April 20th, 2021, 2 Mexican officers were injured in an attack using a drone. Evidence suggests this is only the beginning of an aerial war. In August 2020, police in the same state arrested 2 cartel members. In the trunk of their car, they found 2 drones that had been converted into flying bombs. The criminals attached plastic explosives, a detonator, and a container with ball bearings as shrapnel. It is known that the drones used in the 2021 attack on police officers were identical. Thus, the cartel was apparently attempting to set up mass production of these devices. This was the first use of drones as a means of warfare, as a weapon. In their methods, cartels are much more inventive than many military forces, and much more frightening. Money is the main power. Drugs generate enormous amounts of money. It is estimated that the cartel's profits from drug sales reach billions of dollars a year. These funds are not just stashed in suitcases hidden under the floor. They are actively reinvested into criminal schemes, bribery of officials, purchasing weapons, and even in legal businesses. Cartels buy everything they can, from police officers and judges to politicians, allowing them to grease the system from within. It is thanks to money that they can maintain their power in regions and continue to expand their operations. Violence is the language of the cartels. If money doesn't work, force comes into play. Cartels do not hesitate to use the most brutal methods of intimidation. Public executions, torture, and kidnappings are their way of sending a message to those who dare to oppose them. And it's not just about opponents. Often the cartels carry out bloody reprisals among themselves for territorial control. The boundaries between enemies and allies in this world are blurred. Today, you're in one group. Tomorrow, even your friends can turn against you. Considering that many cartel members are former military or police officers, they know perfectly well how to act effectively and with minimal losses to themselves. Los Zetas, for example, are known for their military training and strategic approach to territory capture. For the cartels, violence is not just a way of doing business. It is a genuine policy of intimidation. In this business, they have no competitors. Corruption is a silent ally. No large-scale cartel operation is possible without close ties to politicians and state structures. In regions where the cartels are firmly entrenched, local authorities are often either powerless or bought. Officials turn a blind eye to murders. Police officers pass on information about raids, and judges dismiss charges against criminals. Essentially, cartels have created a parallel power structure where they are the true masters of the situation. Notably, the cartels do not always seek to directly seize power. It is enough for them to influence those already in power by controlling them through bribery or threats. This creates an illusion of legitimacy, even though in reality, criminal organizations are the ones making decisions. For many politicians, it is easier to strike a deal with a cartel than to wage war against it. Money, violence, and corruption form the three pillars on which the power of Mexican cartels rests. These factors intertwine so skillfully that the cartels not only survive, but also thrive, despite the endless attempts by the government and international forces to end their reign. The cartels are not just criminal organizations, but parallel power structures that permeate all levels of the state system. They bribe politicians, control local officials, intimidate judges and law enforcement officers, and in some regions effectively replace state institutions. Corruption is the main tool of the cartels. They invest millions of dollars in bribing high-ranking officials and security forces. In 2020, former Mexican Security Minister Genaro Garcia Luna was arrested in the United States for collaborating with the Sinaloa cartel. Investigations revealed that for many years, he provided protection to the cartel, helped them avoid arrests, and eliminated competitors. Cartels even influence elections. They sponsor loyal candidates, fund election campaigns, and eliminate unfavorable ones. In some states, such as Guerrero and Michoacán, cartels effectively determine who will govern the region. Interference in the judicial system is another crucial element. Judges handling cases against cartel leaders regularly receive threats or bribes. If they refuse to cooperate, they are simply eliminated. In 2016, Judge Vicente Bermudez, who was overseeing cases against drug lords, was shot dead in the middle of the street. Cartels also use tactics of terror to pressure authorities. In 2019, in Culiacan, the government was forced to release Ovidio Guzman, son of El Chapo, after Sinaloa cartel gunmen wreaked havoc in the city, attacking military and police stations. This incident demonstrated that the cartels have the power to challenge the state. In fact, in some regions, cartels have replaced state structures. They impose their own taxes, settle disputes, distribute food to the poor, and even provide security, albeit on their own terms. For many Mexicans, they have become the real authority, unlike the weak and corrupt state. Mexican cartels are not just involved in drug trafficking. They influence global politics and security. Their connections with international partners, technological development, and financial resources allow them to maintain their influence even under pressure from authorities. And yet, efforts are made to combat the cartels. So why have they not been defeated yet? When looking at the history of Mexican cartels and their influence today, a logical question arises. What comes next? Can these criminal empires ever be defeated? Or will they forever remain a part of Mexican life? At first glance, the cartels appear to be an invincible force, spreading like a cancer and covering more and more territory. But history, as we know, is full of surprises. What makes the cartels so resilient? Primarily, it's the combination of money, violence, and corruption. Cartels can adapt to any conditions, changing their tactics and strategies according to circumstances. If control on the US border is tightened, they find other smuggling routes. If the authorities start eliminating cartel leaders, new ones quickly rise to take their place. As long as there is a high demand for drugs worldwide and the state's weakness within the country, cartels will thrive. However, there is hope for change. Recently, the international community started to realize that the problem of cartels cannot be solved solely within Mexico. Global efforts are needed to combat drug trafficking, along with significant changes in drug policy approaches. Some experts suggest that legalizing certain types of drugs could be a possible way to reduce cartel revenues and dismantle their economic base. Radical reforms are also needed within Mexico itself. First and foremost, it is necessary to fight poverty and social inequality, which supply cartels with new recruits. Providing people with legal earning opportunities, developing infrastructure, and supporting small businesses could weaken the influence of drug lords in the regions. Can the Mexican government defeat the cartels? This is a complex question that history will perhaps answer one day. Victory is possible, but it will require time and comprehensive efforts at all levels, from national reforms to international cooperation. One thing is certain: a forceful solution alone doesn't work. The entire system in which cartels thrive must be dismantled, starting with corrupt officials and ending with international trade routes.